Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, who is second in line for the presidency, is embarking on a tour of the Indo-Pacific. The burning question is, will one of the stops be Taiwan? Her office released a statement on the trip this morning with some visits listed. Taiwan was absent, but it's not the kind of stop she would probably telegraph. China has made it abundantly clear that a visit to Taiwan would be seen as a great escalation. Beijing said it would take resolute and forceful measures in response to such a visit. To make sense of this all, I want to bring in Admiral Mike Mullen. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff between 2007 and 2011. In that role, he was the chief military advisor to Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Welcome, Mike. Let me ask you first, isn't it likely that Nancy Pelosi has decided not to go to Taiwan? In other words, when the Speaker of the House issues a press release where she lists the places she's going, she did say that the trip will include those stops. Is it possible she might make a surprise visit to Taiwan even though she hasn't listed it?
Hi, Fareed. It's really good to be with you. I would expect that it is very possible that she could still make a surprise visit. As controversial and as important as this has become, I wasn't surprised at all that it wasn't part of the released schedule. And she's in that area of the world. She's been there many, many times in that area of the world. She feels strongly about supporting the kinds of values that we stand for and working with our friends. So again, and Taiwan has been a friend for a long time, and particularly in a bipartisan way. So it wouldn't surprise me if she went.
Now, she was Speaker of the House for part of the time you were in the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She's a tough, uncompromising person, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, she's a very, very tough woman who knows how to get things done. She cares deeply about the security of our country and the world. She cares deeply about human rights. So I don't think she would do anything that she hadn't really thought through. She understands the stakes. And in the end, I think while if she decides to go, there certainly is increased risk with respect to that. But I think she would do that thinking through the possibilities and the risks very, very well.
How do you think we got to this stage? You know, frankly, it seems surprising to me that the two leading powers of the world have such bad communications that something like this has become a crisis which has a more hair-trigger element to it. There's much less known about it. Both sides, there seems deep mutual distrust. It does feel like a kind of breakdown of diplomacy.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that's been over certainly the better part of a decade, as is often the case for these things happen over time. I think the sanctions that have been imposed on China were a part of it. I think the new leadership and, quite frankly, the conviction of President Xi Jinping in China to impose an authoritarian view, not just in the region, but around the world. I think the lack of trust, we've had in the U.S. Literally thousands of companies where China has stolen the intellectual property. And so I think the tensions, quite frankly, coming out of the Trump administration were pretty high, and that has continued in the Biden administration and gotten more difficult. Xi Jinping's had a pretty difficult year. He signed up with Putin just before the Olympics. His economy is not growing anywhere close to what he expects. He's not been very successful in the zero COVID strategy that he's imposed. There are many companies who are being shut down. You see the reemergence of state-owned enterprises, and this was supposed to be a big year for him because of the election in November, which would generate a third term. So there's an awful lot going on internally in China that's not going his way. I would hope that we don't, and no one gives Xi Jinping a relief valve, if you will, or a life ring, as he's having so many difficult issues internally over the course of the last year or two.
Let me ask you about your trip to Taiwan. You took a trip to Taiwan at the president's behest. You led a delegation of American private citizens, mostly former officials. What was your principal takeaway from that visit to Taiwan?
Well, first of all, and it was in March, so it was right after the Ukraine invasion by Russia. Secondly, it was a bipartisan trip, so we had officials from both sides of the aisle, if you will. There were several takeaways, one of which is President Tsai Ing-wen is a very strong leader, very comfortable in her own skin and understands the issues. Secondly, this is a thriving democracy of 24 million people with our values, with a focus on democracy and freedom, 75% of whom support independence from China. And then thirdly, that China has been incredibly coercive with respect to Taiwan over the last several years. And while I very strongly support the policy of the United States, which is strategic ambiguity, I think because of that coercion, whether it's military or economic or otherwise, that it's a little out of balance. It's been mostly in balance for over 43 years with the structure that we've had. And I think that countries like us, particularly the U.S., there's room for us to sort of rebalance the scale, not to change the policy, because the policy is working. It's really between Taiwan and the mainland. And then lastly is the impact of what's happened in Hong Kong. That really has gotten a very sober view in Taiwan that was supposed to be one system, if you have two systems. Yeah, one country, two systems. And that obviously has gone by the wayside. There are no discussions that I have, Fareed, with respect to Ukraine that don't eventually lead to the question about whether China is going to do the same thing in Taiwan. So back to where I started, President Tsai is very focused on this. She needs support, and she's had good support from the U.S. The country is Taiwan is very isolated from the world. China's done a really good job of doing that. So a visit by somebody like Speaker Pelosi will broaden Taiwan's perspective, which I also think is important.
Stay with us. When we come back, I'm going to ask Admiral Mullen about the war in Ukraine. His views when we come back. The city of Kherson fell. It was the first major city to be taken by Russia. Now Ukraine is mounting a major counteroffensive to take it back. Can it work? Joining me again, Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Mike, so let me put it to you first. Can this counteroffensive really work? And more broadly, the Ukrainian army is still outnumbered 10-1 by the Russian army. The Russians have much larger defense budget. Can Ukraine actually win this?
Well, I think they can, Fareed. It's been amazing what the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people have done so far. And even though outnumbered, seemingly it is more than evenly balanced because of the continued incompetence of the Russian army, mostly army, but Russian armed forces, which has been, from my perspective, somewhat stunning. I think as I look at this, this is from my interactions with my European friends. Europe thinks this is existential. They think Putin's existential. And I think Sweden and Finland joining NATO so quickly or poised to do so is just an example of that. I do believe that Putin still wants all of Ukraine, and he will continue to fight accordingly. I think he's a little bit out of touch in terms of what's going on the ground and out of touch on how badly his forces have performed. But they're better now than they were early. And, unconstrained and unopposed, he'll try to take all of Ukraine. This is a long slog of a fight for Putin in particular to gain his objectives. And I think he has to be stopped. I don't think he's going to stop. I think he has to be forced to settle with respect to how this comes out. And we, our allies, NATO, United States in particular, have to keep providing the kind of arms we have at a rate that will allow the Ukrainians to continue to oppose and sustain the kind of counteroffensive that you're talking about. The spirit is there, the will to fight is there. They have to have that capability. So on balance, I think the Ukrainians will succeed. I just think it's going to take a long, long time to do that. And then that gets into, what should the United States do? What does the EU do in terms of willingness to suffer to make sure this never happens again? And I think that's the case. If you've dealt with the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they think they're next. I would agree with that if we don't stop Putin now. So we all have to kind of brace for a long one and put Russia, I think, and Putin in particular in a position to not do this again.
So let me ask you about one very important piece of this in terms of putting pressure on Russia, because right now, even if Russia doesn't go any further, it has managed to strangle Ukraine economically by shutting down the port of Odessa, by shutting down almost all Ukrainian exports by sea, which is where the bulk of them used to go, all the grain, for example. I've been publicizing Admiral Stavridis, the former NATO commander, has been proposing that the United States and NATO effectively open up Odessa so that Ukraine can export to the world. There's a kind of reflagging operation we did around the Persian Gulf several years ago that you are well familiar with. So there's a way to do it where it doesn't come across as an act of war. It's more a kind of notice to maritimers. Is there such a solution in your view? You're the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but also an admiral. Could the U.S. Navy do something to unlock Odessa?
Well, I think it's a decision for President Biden, and honestly, I've been mystified that we haven't put U.S. Navy ships up into the Black Sea to create the kind of corridor that you're speaking of, and that has been mentioned before by other individuals who served. That it is doable. The worry that I have is the longer we delay that, the harder it's going to be. Those who operate at sea, both on the Russian and the U.S. side, understand that environment, and contrary or different from the use of quote unquote potential use of nuclear weapons. There's nothing that's going to happen at sea that's going to turn this into World War III specifically. And you now see the human carnage associated with it. And I think the U.S. and our allies, quite frankly, have to do a lot more to control the Black Sea and control that sea lane so that we can get that grain and those exports out to so many needy countries who were on the edge of food insecurity when this war started and now are deeply into it, probably much more deeply than we really understand.
Admiral Mullen, always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you, sir.